today to kick off this series with Lisa Miller. Lisa is one of the most distinguished white-collar crime lawyers in Washington, having recently left the Department of Justice, where she was the Deputy Assistant AG for both fraud and appellate work. And she's here to share some of her perspectives today with us on one of the topics that's been certainly lighting up the ethics and compliance blogs, and that is what's happened to the FCPA. I saw one commentary yesterday that suggested that the administration had put FCPA enforcement on Ozempic, and I think we're going to learn today that that's not quite the case. Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. I'm so thrilled to be here with you. Always a pleasure.
Great. We're going to start off, we've got a new format that we're trying out with 3 rapid-fire questions, and then we'll get into the substance of them. So the first is, as we know, there have been a lot of DOJ policy changes in enforcement priorities, in voluntary disclosures, monitors, whistleblowers, and other areas that were announced in May and then most recently last week. And there's been a lot of speculation that that's really marking a significant change in direction from previous administrations. You have to answer yes or no, but then you can talk later.
I love this cross-examination out of the gate, Susan. So my first answer is no.
Thanks. That was successful. The second question is, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is less of a compliance risk now than under previous administrations.
No.
And the third question is, ethics and compliance teams have to play an undiminished and critical role in ensuring FCPA compliance for their organizations.
That is an unqualified yes. While I emphatically answered the other 2 no's, I have a bit of a mix of emotions, but the third is an emphatic yes, Susan.
So let's jump right in. So what are the most significant developments that ethics and compliance professionals need to pay attention to amid the welter of reboots and guidance and priority shifts?
4 things here, Susan. And first is what hasn't changed amid the reboots. And that's the Department of Justice's evaluation of corporate compliance programs, or ECCP framework, which advocates for a risk-based approach to compliance, where companies should take into account the business lines they have, the industries and the geographies where they operate, and their size when they're determining what an appropriate compliance program is that will be effective for their organization. And that's separate and apart from any priorities announced by the Department of Justice. The second thing I'll point to is it's a significant thing that the Department of Justice is prioritizing white-collar crime. And part of that messaging has referred to the role that compliance officers have to play in crime prevention. Here, I'm specifically referring to remarks made by the current head of the criminal division, Matt Gagliotti, where he indicated that compliance officers have a unique role to play in the fight. And that's consistent with prior messaging across administrations. The new white-collar priorities differ slightly. They include classic areas of enforcement, such as foreign bribery offenses, healthcare fraud, procurement fraud, government program fraud, money laundering, and investment fraud, as well as new and emerging priorities, such as crimes perpetrated by Chinese companies listed on U.S. exchanges, trade fraud, and tariff evasion. The third thing I wanted to note is that instilling a speak-up culture and adequate internal reporting mechanisms are as important as they've ever been. The Department of Justice's Corporate Whistleblower Awards pilot program, which I and others helped to roll out last year, was not only retained, but in fact recently expanded to include 4 new subject matter areas that include trade and tariff evasion, procurement fraud, violations of federal immigration law by corporations, and sanctions, material support of terrorism, and cartel-related offenses. You should also note that the department made permanent as part of the new version of the Corporate Enforcement and Voluntary Self-Disclosure Policy for the Criminal Division, sometimes shorthanded as the CEP, the temporary amendment that was launched in connection with the Corporate Whistleblower Awards pilot program. And that amendment expanded the circumstances where companies can receive declinations for voluntary self-disclosures. Specifically, if a company makes a disclosure within 120 days of a report by a whistleblower, they can still receive the benefit of the declination, even though that previously hadn't been the case. Fourth and finally, the new FCPA guidelines and the head of the criminal division's speech last week framing those guidelines make clear that U.S. as well as foreign companies should remain concerned with anti-bribery and corruption compliance, not only because ethical things are the right things to do, and they tend to be in corporate codes of conduct. While the overall thesis accompanying the rollout was that the Department of Justice will enforce the FCPA and the new Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, for that matter, when it will vindicate U.S. interests, the Department of Justice was careful to emphasize that prosecuting United States companies and individuals may also vindicate U.S. interests if they meet the new guidelines. So many companies maintained their commitments to anti-corruption and anti-bribery compliance during the so-called FCPA pause, but it's all the more important now to maintain commitment to those programs.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm very glad you mentioned that the ECCP is still around too, because that's really so fundamental to putting in place a good ethics and compliance program. And it certainly doesn't sound like enforcement has really ramped down. So let's dig in a little bit more on some of the new policies. And do the shifts announced in February and then the guidance that just came out actually lessen the scope and likelihood of FCPA enforcement, in your view?
I love all these contrarian questions, Susan. So the short answer is it depends, and I'll give the longer answer. So on the one hand, it may be tempting to view these guidelines as narrowing the potential scope or likelihood of enforcement, because the tenor of the executive order pausing FCPA enforcement and the accompanying fact sheet underpinning that pause intimated that prior enforcement had been overzealous, too robust. But if you read the new guidelines, the criteria are actually quite broad, and many fact patterns may meet that criteria. The criteria includes serious bribery offenses, offenses that undermine U.S. competitiveness, offenses that may cause harm to U.S. national security. And even the cartel-related category of this guidance is broader than what some initially thought, following Attorney General Pam Bondi's memo called Total Elimination of Cartels. Under the new guidance, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche directed prosecutors to focus on FCPA offenses involving officials who've previously received bribes from cartels or transnational criminal organizations. So this could in fact cause a surge in FCPA enforcement matters involving Mexico in the coming years. And I'll note that many prior FCPA fact patterns did involve Mexico, such as trading companies cases, to name one example. While some may also be tempted to read the language about not targeting routine business practices, which is part of the guidance on what amounts to a serious bribery offense, as a sign that enforcement will drop, if those routine business practices in other countries undermine America's ability to compete, or this administration's view of what is necessary for U.S. national security or access of companies to critical minerals, depending on the facts, it may very well be game on there too. Finally, recall that there were extremely robust years for FCPA enforcement in 2019 and 2020 during the first Trump administration. So my answer is it depends. We'll see what this means in the short term and the long term. And outside of FCPA, just this week alone, there's been a declination announced by the department as well as a deferred prosecution agreement. So it seems that some corporate enforcement data points are coming on the map.
Right. So really time will tell, but it certainly doesn't sound like there's any definite sign that it's going to weaken. And I also think focusing on the supply side is something that people have really been talking about, but not doing that much of for a long time because it's difficult. Thanks for that. Last, let's get into when it would make sense for a company to consider self-disclosing misconduct. I know that's always, having sat in the seat of a chief ethics and compliance officer, that's one of the most difficult decisions that you can make. So I'd love to get your views on that.
Absolutely. It's a difficult and an incredibly fact-bound decision. So I am going to point to factors here rather than specific guidance of a perfect case for self-disclosure. But one factor to consider, I think, is the risk that the misconduct may soon become public, either through news reporting or other sources, or a whistleblower. Another factor is if conduct already is public and known, but a company can still perhaps meet the sentencing guidelines criteria in 8C 2.5G of being able to disclose prior to an imminent threat of disclosure or government investigation. That may be a circumstance, along with the first circumstance I cited of a risk that news of the conduct may become public, where if it's going to be out there anyway, a better way to deal with it may be by trying to proactively engage with the government if steps have been made toward remediation and identifying the scope of the misconduct. That may be particularly true. Smaller scope offenses may be worth self-disclosing, and I'll note here that if you analyze all of the fraud sections prior corporate enforcement policy declinations, the average disgorgement amount or loss associated with them is around $11 million. So it's a data point that identifies the scope is not typically a massive multi-country foreign bribery scheme that lasted more than a decade, but rather, an offense that is, at least in financial terms, fairly small scope. The department's inability to pay guidance, of course, also does apply in the CEP declination context. So that's a factor that the government continues and may skew some of that data. But big picture, it's typically not the incredibly pervasive long-running schemes that are sensible to self-disclose. The next factor is cases in which statute of limitations may soon run. That may be a good circumstance for a company to get finality. It puts a bit of a limit on, when the government may be up against for timing, although typically as part of cooperation, it would be expected a company would agree to toll the statute. If it's old and dated conduct anyway, the department may be even more appreciative of a company coming forward because the witness memories would be even more stale, given the statute of limitations, on the horizon. And then now, given the new guidance, I think that part of it almost invites disclosure of offenses that may border on facilitation payments, maybe where it's a close call to whether something is a facilitation payment or not. Maybe this moves the needle incrementally toward disclosing that sort of fact pattern, so certainty could potentially be obtained. But I will caution that on the other end of the spectrum, inevitably, a company does lose an amount of control by self-disclosing a fact pattern to the department, because the department has to conduct an independent investigation and can't accept the say-so of any company, however ethical or well-intentioned. And so that means there will be a lack of control, and there will be a time frame that is not of the company's choosing, even in the best of circumstances. And of course, that also means there will be other costs. So it's a fact-based decision, but there could be strategic opportunities, whether around mergers and acquisition fact patterns and, an effort to take advantage of the department's M&A safe harbor policy, or whether, around some of the circumstances I described to get in front of a whistleblower. Recent department messaging has also noted that their view is that because this corporate enforcement policy has broadened incentives for voluntary self-disclosure, if companies do not take advantage of those policies, they may move more aggressively. So again, it's going to be an incredibly fact-based calculus, but there are circumstances where it could make sense depending.
That's very balanced answer and very comprehensive. And it's interesting you mentioned getting in front of a whistleblower, and now with the DOJ whistleblower program up and going and continuing, that becomes an even bigger risk.
That's right. And you still have, under the policy, 120 days within a whistleblower coming forward, but it may be even better to try to get out in front of the whistleblower coming to the department to further manage the situation.
I think you gave us a tremendous amount of information right on point. So I want to thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Susan. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you in person soon.